صلوات على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء المرسلين، حبيب الله العالمين والقاسم المصطفى محمد.
اللهم صل على
وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. Assalamu alaikum, brothers, sisters, and respected scholars. Inshallah, we want to continue our discussions from our previous nights as we move on to the third day of Ramadan, of our Ramadan series. And in this series, of course, if you've been along with me, we have been discussing the Nahj al-Balagha of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And we know that this is the peak of eloquence, is in the name, and the actual content within the book is the peak of eloquence. When we discuss eloquence, we mean in the way that someone speaks, in the way that they write. It is a way that it brings people to awe when they hear it, when they see it, when they read it. And when we say the peak of eloquence, when Sharif al-Ali, he compiles these, he finds that Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, he's the most beautiful of reciters, the most beautiful of speakers. And this is the peak of eloquence of Amir al-Mu'mineen. And this is how he's come to create the Nahj al-Balagha, or compile the Nahj al-Balagha of Imam Ali alayhi salam. One question that's asked about the Nahj al-Balagha is, by many people who might doubt the book, is what is the authenticity of this book? Now I want to turn back onto this because some of you might also be questioning this. I want to, of course, note here that the Nahj al-Balagha itself, Sharif al-Razi does not bring any chains of narration, because that's not the goal at the end of the day of why he's compiled this book. He's compiled it as a book to show Imam Ali alayhi salam's eloquence, to show how beautifully he speaks. So he doesn't bring a chain of narrations, because that's not his goal with this book. But we know there's other scholars that come by later on who later find the sources of which he's of each separate sermon that he has in this book. And when they do so, because he only brings a certain part of a sermon. Sometimes Imam Ali alayhi salam has a sermon that's 1 hour long when he's sitting on the pulpit, but Sharif Razi brings only a sentence, which is, of course, one of his sayings, his maxims. So when our scholars have decided to bring all these books together, to bring them in their full speech, to bring the full speech, as opposed to, for example, just a part, they found that the Nahj al-Balagha, in total, if we bring everything together, brings up to 7 volumes of the book. So it's very expansive. There's so many narrations or chains that are authenticated. So inshallah, with that said, and that as a precursor to our discussion tonight, we begin our discussion of sermon number 82, or it might be sermon 83 in some books. They do differ in the amount of the number, but this sermon is Khutbah al-Gharra. Khutbah al-Gharra is one of the sermons of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. And what Gharra specifically means, the meaning of this specific word, Gharra, is that it is a brilliant sermon. A sermon that when people hear it, they're completely in awe. They're amazed. The amazing sermon, the brilliant sermon. And this is one of the most famous of the sermons of Nahj al-Balagha. So inshallah, I wanted to look into this sermon specifically. And this is a very long sermon and it spans a few pages, so I don't want to go through all of it. But there's multiple speakers that have a series on this specific sermon, and they speak through every single part, as there's 12 parts total in this sermon, but of course we want to look on very specific excerpts that I've picked from this. So inshallah, we're going to begin that with a loud salawat of yours. Continuing on our previous discussions on what true success is, we've discussed knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and truly becoming pious and being aware of Him and conscious of Him in every moment within our day. I want to continue that, of course, with our next level in which we want to discuss this relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is understanding our akhirah, understanding where we're going to go after our death. Because when insan is unaware about what happens to them after he's passed, he doesn't realize what is coming. He's only lost within this material world, as we've discussed. And this is a focal point in the works of Imam Ali alayhi salam. To understand that if we look at it through a very material lens, then we become a slave of this world. Where Imam Ali alayhi salam says, break free from those chains. To break free from the chains of that which is enslaving you within this world. And know that you are only the slave for someone who is the master, who is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So with that, inshallah, we're going to begin sermon of Al-Gharra. And this is the most wonderful of his sermons. Praise be to Allah who is high above all else and is near the creation through his bounty. He is the giver of all rewards and distinction and dispeller of all calamities and hardships. I praise him for his continuous mercy and his copious bounties. And we discussed his bounties and his mercy in our previous lecture. We described when Imam Ali described how merciful Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says when we said the rahmah of Allah is his mercy which is beyond comparison. When we say mercy, the English word for mercy doesn't even compare to the rahmah, which is the word in Arabic. In a way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is like a mother who, even if their child makes a mistake, even if they made the most largest of mistakes, his door is always open. And he says, come back to me. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the true repentance of one of the sinners. So inshallah, then he continues on. I believe in him as he is the first of all and he is manifest. I seek guidance from him as he is near and he is the guide. I seek his succor as he is mighty and he is subduer. I depend upon him as he is sufficer and the supporter. I stand witness that Muhammad is his slave and his prophet. He sent him for enforcement of his commands, for exhausting his pleas and for presenting warnings against eternal punishment. When he begins his sermon, he describes how he seeks Allah. Listen to how he seeks specific aspects of Allah. I believe in him as he is the first of all, he is manifest. Sometimes we say, I believe in Allah. I believe that Allah exists. But we don't specifically say as to why. Now Imam Ali alayhi salam, he responds as to why he believes it so. He says, I believe in him as he is the first of all and he is the manifest. He is the one who has puts everything into place and he is the first. That is why I believe him. And we discussed that on the first night as to why we believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and how we know God. I seek guidance from him. Sometimes we just say, I seek guidance and that's it. But he continues, why do you seek guidance from him? As he is the near and he is the guide. He is qareeb and he is the guide for me. This is the reason. I could seek anyone else, but he is the one who is near and he is the one who is the guide. That's why I seek him. I seek his succor as he is mighty and a subduer. So he says, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is mighty, I seek for his help. And I depend on him. Sometimes we say, I depend on Allah. Why do you depend on Allah? As he is a sufficer and he is the supporter. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala suffices for me. Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakeel. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of ones who is managing our affairs. And that is a completely different discussion than what we had, which Allah is al-wakeel. But he says, I depend only on Allah as he is the only support that I need. Now, the sermon specifically, as we begin, I want to begin a discussion here as to our next key to success of Amir al-Mu'min alayhi salam. And this success is realizing the day of judgment and realizing our death. Because it said in relation to this sermon that Imam Ali alayhi salam attended the funeral of someone. And there were many people who were crying for this person and they were crying as to why he's passed away. And Imam Ali alayhi salam, he begins on this. He says that you should not fear or you should not be crying for him, because for him it's much easier than how it is for you. Because if you saw what he saw in that grave, as to your affairs, it would be much worse. It is our matters which is the one in which we should be crying for, because we're unaware of that which is in the hereafter. For them, they've found that path and they've gone ahead and they've passed away. And they're connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's you who is in that position that's alive today, that is manifesting your affairs in the akhirah right now. And it is you that should be worried about yourselves. And this is how we begin his discussion. How Imam Ali alayhi salam will skip on to, as he says, this caution about this world. He says, you are on test in this world and you have to render account about it. Certainly this world is a dirty watering place and a muddy source for drinking. Its appearance is attractive, and its inside is destructive. It is a delible deception, a vanishing reflection, and a bent pillar. When its despiser begins to like it, and he who is not acquainted with it feels satisfied with it, then it raises and puts down on its feet in joy, entraps him in its trap, makes him the target of his arrows, and puts around his neck the rope of death, taking him to the narrow grave and fearful abode in order to show him his place of stay and the recompense of his acts. This goes on from generation to generation. Neither death stops from cutting them asunder, nor do the survivors keep aloof from committing of sins. And he very straightforward explains to you that the person who is so busy within this world, someone who's fallen into this world, they fall in because they believe that the appearance that the world has given to him is that which is of an attractive appearance. But once they fall into that world, they realize the deception. And then they realize when their death is near that they've wasted all of my time in my affairs in a material when I should have been thinking of the hereafter. They're emulating each other and proceedings in groups towards the final objective and the rendezvous of death. Till when matters come to a close, the world dies and resurrection draws near. Allah would take them out from the corner of their graves, the nests of birds, and the dens of beasts, and the centers of death. They hasten towards His command and run towards the place fixed for their final return. Group by group, quiet, standing, and arrayed in rows. They will all be within Allah's sight and will hear everyone who would call them. SubhanAllah. Salawat. So Imam Ali, how he describes the hereafter, he describes the day of resurrection, the day that you're going to be risen up, in a very dark way, in how we should understand the realities. He's trying to make the people understand that the hereafter and how it is going to play out. And many of you already know, you've already read about how the hereafter is explained, how you have the book on your right hand. If when you have it on the right hand, you will know that you've done good deeds, but on the left hand, you know that you've done wrong. And there's so much that is explained about the hereafter. But Imam Ali, just to turn back to how he says it, he says when the world dies and resurrection draws near, Allah takes them out of the corner of their graves. So you're in that grave, and you're in that place where you're resting in that moment. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes you out in that moment. Just like He takes out the nests of the birds, the dens of the beasts, and the centers of death, they bring them out, and they hasten toward His command. They run towards a fixed place. And this is when the akhirah begins. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He brings people back, He brings you into a fixed place, and then the day of judgment begins. And He says that the final they group by group, they come by, and they're quiet. There's no words. You have nothing to say on that day when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, until He begins to question you, you remain silent. And you're standing here just to be ready to be judged. When I hear this, wallah, I get afraid of death. I get afraid of what's going to come. I'm afraid of my affairs, of what I've done. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Zilzal, right, He says, وَمِن مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ خَيْرًا يَرَى وَمَن يَعْمَلْ مِثْقَالَ ذَرَّةٍ شَرًّا يَرَى. This is that moment in your resurrection where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I am in charge of your affairs. And here you're not able to say, no, it wasn't me. That must have been someone else that had done it. That's when we have the testification of the limbs. When the limbs speak for you and they say that I've seen what this person, I testify that he used me to look at this. I testify that he used the feet to go to this place. I testify he used his tongue to say that word. So this is the testification, and this is what the hereafter is. And this is what you should be fearing. Because when we're in this world, we don't remember this, right? We don't pay attention to this. They would be having the dress of helplessness and covering of submission and indignity. At this time, contrivances would disappear, desires would be cut, hearts would sink quietly, voices would be curbed down, sweat would choke the throat, fear would increase, and ears would resound with the thundering voice of the announcer calling towards the final judgment. Awards of recompense, striking of punishments, and paying of reward. This is the eloquence of Amir al-Mu'mineen, how he explains the hereafter, how he explains what is going to happen to us in those moments. And this is that day of judgment that he explains. And then he goes on into the next part. So this part specifically was about the day of judgment. Then he continues to the next passage in which he discusses the limitations of our life. People have been created as a proof of his power, as a sign. They've been brought up with authority. Then they were made to die through pangs and placed in graves where they turned to crumbs. Then they would be resurrected one by one, awarded their recompense, and would have to recount for their actions, each one separately. They've been allowed time to seek deliverance. They've been shown the right paths and have been allowed to live and seek favors. The darkness of doubts had been removed, and they've been let free in this period of life as a training place in order to make preparation for the race on the day of judgment, to search for the objective with thoughtfulness, and to get time necessary to secure benefits and provide for the next place of stay. And that's the fundamental point on how he explains what life is, right, in that last passage. He says, you've been brought onto this earth, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed you right here, and you've begun that stopwatch. Now you have a specific set of time. You're very limited, right? What's 100 years in the grand scheme of things? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins, He puts you onto the earth, and then there's your task. And what is that task? Of course, He says that task is, they've been let free in this period of life as a training place in order to make preparation for the race on the Day of Judgment. To search for objective with thoughtfulness. We are in search of that which is our objective. That is our goal. And to get the time necessary to secure the benefits and provide for the next place of stay. So everything that occurs right after you're placed on that earth, right after you're placed down, and you begin that journey to your hereafter, everything is which you manifest. And that which is slowly being created in your hereafter. Every single action in which you commit. Every single goodness that you commit into this world. Every single good thing that you do is something that is being prepared in your hereafter. It's being manifested. Just like Allah in the Quran, He says the person who eats of that which is for the yatim, that who eats for that which is for someone who is an orphan. They're not eating that. In reality, they're eating fire that's going into their stomachs. This is a verse in the Quran. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that everything that's happening within this world is being manifested into your next world. One single good thing that you do is being prepared for you in the hereafter. One single good thing that you're going to do is prepared for you. One single bad thing that you do, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just like we said, the one who eats from the orphan, that which is the haqq of the orphan, he's eating fire. So this is being manifested already in your hereafter in that way. And then he continues about the preparation for that day of judgment. We're skipping through a few parts here, but we continue into the next part. And let's hear what he has to say for the preparation. And know that you have to pass over the pathway of Sirat, where steps waver, feet slip away, and there are fearful dangers at every step. Everyone knows of the Sirat, right? It's that bridge that you have to cross over. And if you're able to cross over, you enter Jannah. But if not, you're manifesting that bridge right now to how wide that bridge is going to be, to prepare that bridge of that Sirat. The steps waver, feet slip away, and there are fearful dangers at every single step at that moment. O creatures of Allah, fear Allah like the fearing of the wise men, whom the thought of the next world has turned him away from all matters. Fear of Allah has afflicted his body with trouble and pain. His engagement in the night prayer has turned even his short sleep into awakening. Hope of eternal recompense keeps him thirsty in the day. Abstention has curbed his desires, and remembrance of Allah is ever moving in his tongue. He entertains fear before dangers. He avoids uneven ways in favor of clear ones. He follows the shortest route to secure his purpose. Wishfulness does not twist his thinking, and ambiguities do not blind his eyes. He enjoys deep sleep and passes his day happily because of the happiness of the good tidings and pleasures of the eternal bounties. This is the preparation of the old man that he describes. So he says, okay, now you've heard about what's happening in the hereafter. Now you know about what to fear, where you're going to stand up and you're going to be judged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then he says, be like this old man, the one who is aware of that akhirah. And he discusses different points about what he has to do. The fearing wise man who has turned his affairs. The fear of Allah has afflicted his body with trouble and pain. His engagement in the night has turned even his short sleep into wakening. So this is 2 points. He's had that fear of Allah to a point where it's affected him. He's awake at the night and he's praying his night prayers. What else does he say about the wise man? He says, hope of that eternal recompense, that which gets the ajr from Allah, keeps him thirsty in the day. Abstention has curbed his desires. He's completely removed from his desires. And remembrance of Allah is ever moving in his tongue. That dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always remains in his tongue. He's always making sure to do the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the wise man. For he's preparing for that day of judgment. He has Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always that dhikr in his mind. He entertains fear before dangers. He avoids uneven ways in favor of clear ones. He follows the shortest route to secure his purpose. Wishfulness does not twist his thinking, and ambiguities do not blind his eyes. He enjoys deep sleep and passes his day happily, because the happiness, he's aware of that, of the good tidings of the hereafter. This is the wise man who is prepared, and this is the level of preparation that we need to have for that day of judgment. And he continues, he passes the pathways of this world in a praiseworthy manner. He reaches the next world with his virtues. Because of course we say that that which is going to happen into the next world, that which you are going to have, is not your money. It's not going to be the power. It's not going to be what you've gained in this world, except for virtues, that which you have. That's which your actions have shown. He hastens towards virtue out of fear. He removes briskly during the short time of life in this world. He devotes himself in seeking eternal good. He runs away from evil. During today, he is mindful of tomorrow, and he keeps the future in his view. And I want to just point this one out. During today, he is mindful of tomorrow, and he keeps the future in his view. This person's tomorrow is always in his mind, right? So some of us are very short-term thinking. Insan as a whole thinks in this manner. It thinks of, what am I going to get in the nearest time possible, right? In the shortest amount of time, how can I get money? In the shortest amount of time, how can I get rich? In the shortest amount of time, how am I going to be able to do this? Because we're always thinking of how near. We're very nearsighted in the way that psychologically insan is interested in getting that rush, getting that dopamine rush, being able to reach something in a very quick manner. It's not thinking of tomorrow in the way that they have to think very much into the future. So what does he say? He says that this wise man who's preparing for the next world, during today he is mindful of tomorrow. He's prepared for his akhirah, he's prepared for his future. And he keeps the future within his view. Certainly paradise is the best reward and achievement, which hell is appropriate punishment and suffering. Allah is the best avenger and helper, and the Quran is the best argument and confronter. Salawat. So this is the person who has to prepare for the hereafter. And this is our views. And that's the next key to our success of Amir al-Mu'minin Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. He says that he is aware of his hereafter. He is aware of his death. He's aware of what's going to happen to him. He's aware about that day of akhirah that's going to begin, where he's going to stand up and he's going to have to respond to every single sin that he's committed in this world. He is aware of that. And then we described how this person, this wise man who's preparing for that, how he thinks. And that is what we've arrived at. So finally, I'm going to end off here at the end of his sermon. As we skip through a few more points, we begin to the lessons of those who have passed away. From what we can learn about those who have lived this world and they have already passed. O creatures of Allah, where are those who were allowed long ages to live and they enjoyed bounty? They were taught and they learnt, they were given time and they passed in vain. They were kept healthy and they forgot their duty. They were allowed long periods of life, were handsomely provided, were warned of grievous punishment, and were promised big rewards. You should avoid sins that lead to destruction and vices that attract wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, Ya insan, you've heard of the people before you. You've heard of those who were given so many blessings from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You've heard of people who've been given so many bounties which have arrived. What have they done with it? At the end of the day, they leave this world through every single bounty they received, every single blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given them, they've passed in vain. Everything leads to nothing at the end of the day. Learn from these people. Learn so we don't make those mistakes. O people who possess eyes and ears, and health and wealth, is there any place for protection, any shelter of safety, or asylum, or haven, or occasion to run away or to come back to this world? If not, how are you then turned away, which is in the Quran? And whither are you averting? By what things have you been deceived? Certainly the share of every one of you from this earth is just a piece of land, equal to its own stature and size, where he would lie on his cheek covered with dust. The present is an opportune moment for acting. We are here in this moment. We've been given the bounties of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What are we doing with it? We've been given health, we've been given wealth. There's another passage here which Imam Ali alayhi salam explains the different bounties that Allah gives you. But of course, due to the lack of time, I wasn't able to go through it. But we're already aware about how much bounties of Allah that's been given to us. What are we doing with it? Where are we putting these kind of bounties? Where are we putting these blessings? Are we like those people from before us who lived their life and lived in a manner that at the end of the day they left with nothing? Are we living in that manner? No, Ali is waking you up to that which is in the hereafter. He's waking you up to make you prepared for that which is coming. O creatures of Allah, since the neck is free from the loop and the spirit is also unfettered, now you have time for seeking guidance. You are in ease of body. You can assemble in crowds. The rest of life is before you. You have opportunity of acting by will. There is opportunity for repentance and peaceful circumstances. You have so much time right now. That clock is ticking, of course, but you have so much time. They say that the person at the end of their life, when they're passing away, when they're close to passing away, when Israel comes to them, what do they say? They say, please give me one more day of Ramadan in which I can fast, one more day of Ramadan in which I can ask Allah for forgiveness. But Israel says, no, there's no more time, that's it. You've reached the end of your line. And this is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will now judge you. Be prepared for that day. Be prepared for that day in which you don't have any more time. Where the stopwatch is, done. You're at zero. Now he says what? He says, now you have the time for seeking guidance. Now you have the ease of your body. Now you can assemble in crowds. And the rest of their life is in before you. And you have this opportunity. He's ending off in a very light note and he's saying that's, okay, we've discussed about the fear of Jahannam. We've discussed the fear about those who were before you. But now what? Now there's an opportunity of hope. There's an opportunity for you to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to find guidance. Because now you have that time. Before you're overtaken by narrow circumstances and distress, or fear and weakness, before the approaches of the way to death, and before the seizure by Almighty the Powerful. Salawat. And that's how we're going to end off tonight. To be reminded by Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam's reminder to us about death. And his reminder of his punishment. And reminder of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we need to keep within our minds. We need to keep within our tongues. We need to keep that dhikr. Because we only have a certain limited amount of time. There are people who are millionaires and they wish they could trade their money for time. But we have something that is so much more. So don't make sure that, especially during this month of Ramadan, that you use it wisely. Coming into these nights of Laylatul Qadr, make sure that you use these time very wisely. Because we don't have a lot of it, right? Don't be like that person who at the end of times asks Allah for one more day so that they can do istighfar. So inshallah, we'll continue these discussions and continue with the next key to success in the following nights. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد